The motion is, that is the proposition for our tonight's discussion is, should the West make amends with Putin? The West should make amends with Putin. And here we have two people who say yes, the West should. And here we have two people who say no, the West should not. You know that Russia is not a topic that is not debated in this town. But you also know that indeed the subject has a much wider European significance. And that's why we're particularly happy to have, a somewhat broader setting of people with us tonight, not just the usual Berlin crowd whom you can meet anyway every week in our debates. And I hope you will benefit from it. The disadvantage is the debate will be in English. And you will have to raise everything also in English. But that is the price that comes with taking a broader perspective for this purpose. Now, these speakers will not be as free to speak to you as I am, because they will make their initial statements from here, and then the entire discussion will continue from there. So with that said, I will not give you my reading of what the West should do with Russia, but I would rather like you to end your votes now. So we will close the voting now. So don't try to cast your more votes. You will see that it is closed. And let's move to the opening presentations. And I would like to ask to speak in favor of the motion first, Dominique Moisi. Dominique, before you do so, I have to praise you a little bit. You know that usually nobody who is on stage on an event like this needs an introduction. That's why everyone gets one, because nobody needs one. Dominique Moisi is, in my view, one of the most experienced thinkers of Europe's international role, its challenges, its opportunities, its constraints, and also, I think, a thinker of geostrategy, if you will. I don't know if that is an adequate term, but I don't know another Frenchman whom I have seen thinking so long and so consistently as Dominique Moisi. Now, that may be my fault, but it certainly says something about him. He's been, for many years, for ages, with the French Institute of International Relations. He's now with the Institut Montaigne, a rather strong and influential think tank in Paris now. He's published widely on international affairs, on foreign policy, on big powers in their strategies. And I look forward, Dominique, to what you have to say to us today. You anchor. So, Dominique, please, over there.
You should discount that from my minutes. I'm small. If the wording of the motion is the West should make amends with Putin, I'm siding with the other side.
You're not allowed to do that, Dominique. I'm sorry.
And I don't like this expression. If the expression is the West should play diplomatically with Russia, should try to combine engagement and containment with Russia, then I say, all right. I'm not naive. I know what Russia is in terms of its essence right now, in terms of its performance. It is attempting to destabilize our democratic regime in the most negative manner. It has militarized its diplomacy in the most dangerous way. So I'm not here to say Russia is good, Russia has been unnecessarily humiliated by us, we should make amends for what we did. This is not my position. I'm neither a nostalgic of the time of the Ostpolitik in the 1970s, nor a nostalgic of the Gaullist attempt to be in between the West and the East. That would be totally anachronistic. We are not in the 1970s, we are even less so in the 1960s. So if I think we should try to do something different, it's for two major reasons. The first one is pragmatism. What we've been doing so far has clearly not worked. Russia has become more aggressive as time went by. But the real reason is that I think I have a strategic vision of the world which is dominated by two key factors. The first one is that America is not what America used to be. Today, Macron may try to engage with Putin, but there is someone who is encouraging Putin, who is the best ally of Putin. And this is not the French president, but this is the American president. If you see what he did recently by legalizing the settlement in Israel, is this not the best encouragement given to Russia's attitude towards Crimea? It is simply saying that might is right. The second point is that not only is not America what America used to be, but China has become the real challenge, not only for the West, but for Russia as well. To a large extent, if we want to make an historical analogy, it is with the 1870s, 1880s, the end of the 19th century, the period George Kennan, the father of containment, wrote about in his book, The Decline of Bismarck's European Order. At that time, France and Russia came together. France as a defeated country, humiliated by Germany, and Russia as a country looking with anxiety to the rise of its neighbor on the West. And to some extent, the equivalent of Germany at the Wilhelmian period is China. And we have to inspire ourselves from the teachings of that period. And so, if I remember quite well, there was a British diplomat in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, who coined what would become more or less the policy of the West towards Russia. He said, let's engage Russia if we can. Let's contain Russia if we must. The difficulties of today is that we have to do both, engaging and containing. And this can be done with a little subtlety and with an awareness of the fact that the real problem is not Russia but China, and that the strength of Russia should not be overestimated. It is a very weak country economically, and Russians' elite are starting to be more and more aware of that. So we have to say to Russia, all right, we're not going to trust you. You don't trust us. We're not going to simply say you're bad and contain you. We are going to say the ball is on your side. Your problem is with the East, not with the West. You need a complete structural reviewing of your strategic priority. Do you want ever to be forever the junior partner of China? A China that will console you, flatter you, but that in the end will say, well, I have 20 million people on that side, there are only 6 million there. Maybe we should redraw the cards. So that is what I'm doing, but that is what I'm thinking. This is why somewhere I'm not saying the West should make amends with Putin, but the West should reconsider its policy with Russia and play with Russia the way the West played in the 19th century old diplomacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Of course, I tried to smuggle a bit of that into my opening speech, so sorry. Apologies in advance. Thank you very much for inviting me. I accepted this and then sort of looked at the format and realised that I hadn't actually done a debate since I was at school and was 18 years old. So don't come expecting slick professionalism. That is all I will say. That is not my brand. But it did remind me that I was a student when the Berlin Wall came down, and I was incredibly lucky to live through that moment in history. And I travelled through the Eastern Bloc and through Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan, and I met amazing people. I benefited from the generosity and hospitality of Russian people, and I have incredibly fond memories of that period of my life. And so I say that because everything I'm saying is not coming from this position of Russophobia or anything like that. It is coming from the point of view of talking about Putin, because Putin is not the Russian people. And this is two completely separate things. He is an authoritarian who oversees a criminal mafia state. And he oversees a system that has enabled this class of oligarchs to steal money from the Russian people, to steal the natural resources of Russia. And they owe this debt of loyalty to him because of that. And of course, the other thing about Putin is that he is an ex-KGB agent. Or as he says, there is no such thing as an ex-KGB agent. And we know, when we think of the KGB, we think of espionage, we think of spying. But of course, that was only part of what they did. The other part of what they set out to do, and that they still set out to do, is subversion. And it's about undermining your enemies, about destabilizing them, about causing chaos. And we now know that this is exactly what Russia did in America in 2016. And we know, it's all been laid out by the FBI, how the GRU subverted and undermined American social media platforms. It set out to do that, and it succeeded. And it set out to steal the emails of the Clinton campaign, and it succeeded. And it set out to have these leaked at times which would be most damaging impact to the campaign, and it succeeded. Russia attacked America, and that is a fact. And it still sounds like a mad conspiracy. We have not processed this at all, I don't think. But this is just a set of facts which has been set out now by the FBI. But we are still in incredible denial about this, and nowhere more so than Britain. Because, at least in America, there has been this amazing investigation. But for us here in Europe, there has not. And I kind of count you as part of that, because what is happening in Britain also very directly affects you. And the only inquiry that's really happened into Russian influence in Britain is this report by the Joint Intelligence Committee in Parliament. And this has been a big news story in Britain of the last few weeks. This has been suppressed. And it's been personally suppressed by Boris Johnson. And so I am here to say to you that we have to wonder why. we have to wonder why we do not want the facts of Russian influence in Britain coming out. And sorry, I'm not sure. How much time have I got?
Well, you have 3 minutes left.
Oh my gosh.
To the 8-minute mark.
So, race. So, I'm just going to skip to the end because I still just want to tell you a little bit more about Boris Johnson because hell, I kind of don't, I'm not, this is an opportunity for me to smuggle some of this information into the public domain. So I wrote this extraordinary story a couple of weeks ago and it was about how in the middle of the Skripal incident, when Russia unleashed a chemical weapon on Britain's streets, this is a weapon prohibited in the use of war. It was used against civilians in a small market town in Britain. We know that Russia attacked our country too, just as it attacked America. And it was the same as the GRU, the military intelligence, again, who was involved. And right in the middle of that crisis, Boris Johnson went off to a summit in Brussels to speak to NATO about Russian sanctions. And that same day, he left his security detail. He flew to Italy to an oligarch's house. And whilst he was there, an ex-KGB agent flew in to meet him in this undisclosed meeting. And as I said, is Putin who says there is no such thing as an ex-KGB agent. Anyway, I'm going to skip to the end and say that a former member of the British intelligence service said to me that we in Britain, we are so naive about Russian influence. We are so deep in denial. And we've got to stop being so naive. And because Russia, it seeks to destroy our freedoms and our prosperity and our security, and it is succeeding. And it wants to remake us in its own image, this criminal mafia state. And so I think the idea of making amends with Russia is absurd and dangerous. And I hope that you not support this motion, do the other thing, overrule this motion, disagree with this motion, vote the other way. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll be talking. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. Yep. So that's got your attention at least. It wasn't intentional. I will be arguing not so much how, maybe later, but certainly why. And I'm going to put forward 5 major arguments about why it's useful to, or why it's timely, perhaps not to make amends, but certainly to engage, to talk, to treat Russia as a state worthy of discussion. And I'm going to have 5 basic arguments. The first one is the historical one, in which we try to put this into context. And indeed, the end of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago, and this was a unique moment. Not only the Eastern European countries, but Russia itself had a democratic revolution. It's still not complete by any means, but it was a moment, an opening, and that moment at the end of the Cold War was ultimately squandered. And in many ways, this explains why we are today what I would certainly now say is a second Cold War. And then the question is, how do we get out of it? That we had a peace order, the Gorbachev at that time, then Yeltsin, Medvedev, Putin, all of them wanted to join and to join the West, what we could call the historical West, that with Russia joining it, it would become a greater West. And then together we could deal with all sorts of global and other issues. Instead of this transformation, which Gorbachev still to this day, in his late 80s, is still arguing that we squandered the peace at the end of the Cold War and that we really do have to find a way. Indeed, in that sense, for Gorbachev's argument, we should be making amends, that we should join to create a new security order. We never did that after the end of the Cold War. And ultimately, as a lot of people would argue, that with expanding NATO, unmediated, would leave Russia on the other side, and then clearly it would have a lot of consequences. So that would be the first argument. The second one is the personal argument. Now, Putin is one of the most traduced, insulting insulted, and indeed demonized figures of our time. Some people call it the Putin derangement syndrome, which a lot of the discussion about Putin is not the man that I've spent, indeed, the last 20-odd years studying, or indeed the testimony of most people who meet him. That Putin has many personalities. Yes, he was a former security official with the KGB, but he was also many other things, including the head of the External Economic Committee in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s under the Democratic mayor Anatoly Sobchak. And at that stage, many people who met him at that time said he was one of the few people who would actually deliver what they promised in terms of economic investment and opportunities and so on. And then when he came to power in 2000, he really did want to change the framework, I mean, I call it the new realism, to engage with the West and say, okay, we've messed it up in the 1990s, but let's try again. David Frost, Lord George Robertson, and so on. The discussion was then even of Russia joining NATO. It was a security dilemma. He wanted to do it. And of course, in September, 25th of September 2001, after 9/11, he spoke in the Bundestag here in Germany, influent German. And if you just look at that speech, this image of this sort of deranged, crazy KGB man out to subvert the West simply doesn't make sense. This is a very different view of it. In many ways, he was still upset that Russia was left out from the transformation which we expected of the security system at the end of the Cold War. And then, unfortunately, it didn't work. The third argument is the prudential argument. This makes, by that I mean, it simply doesn't make sense to keep Russia out. I mean, Macron made this point in his speech to diplomats on the 27th of August this year, where he said that no fundamental question of European security could be dealt with without Russia's participation. All sorts of issues there, nuclear non-proliferation, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the climate crisis even, to make also the question about how to deal with European security issues, and indeed, this is why Russia is supporting the Minsk II agreement over the Donbass, and obviously the Middle East and so on, the whole list of things. So in a sense, work with Russia to deal with it. And you'd find, and many people have found the US forces in Syria working with Russia actually delivers results. And in fact, Russia in many ways could have said that in some ways it has done so. And of course, us Europeans, it makes even more sense to work with Russia. And there's also the fourth argument is the time factor. That a lot of people say, look, it may be time to make amends with Russia, but certainly not with Putin, because Putin is, as it were, such a toxic figure, they would argue. I would argue it's no good waiting for Putin when his term expires in 2024, and his departure will not change anything. It's very easy to say it's Putin is the fault, not the people, not the elite. In actual fact, it's quite clear that he still enjoys quite astronomical popularity. Maybe if there were different choices, different ways we'd be looking at it. And also that he is is a collective Putin. And that in some ways he has expressed the desires of the people. And this is not a revanchist desire. Just even recently, a Levada opinion poll showed that this democratic values of the 1991 revolution are still supported by the mass of the Russian people, and that the political system in which Russia now works is not, certainly not a kleptocracy. There's kleptocratic elements, but it's not a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy is one where you earn 400 billion, say, in oil, and 380 ends up in Swiss bank accounts. In Russia, and it's the other way around, 20 billion ends up in Swiss bank accounts, 380 is invested. There's national projects now. They're investing $500 billion in health, welfare, infrastructure, and so on. This isn't a criminal state. This isn't a kleptocracy. And the final point is that, maybe a bit vague, but just to say, finish the fourth one. Clearly, after Putin, there will be, almost certainly, the foreign policy is one which reflects national interests as they're defined, and after that, even After Putin, you'd get a Schmutin or somebody like that who would continue the same policy. But even worse, you'd get somebody who could be much tougher. The fifth argument is the philosophical one. Now, you could say this is a bit vague, but really philosophical, cultural, if you like. Russia is part of European and indeed Western civilization, of Christendom. It has been for a long time. What has actually happened, though, of course, is that this political West, as it took shape after 1945, you could call it the Atlantic West, after 1989, did not manage to expand, as I say, in an inclusive and engaging manner. This has been, as I said, it wasn't even Putin. This is Yeltsin in 1994 talked about the Cold Peace. I was waiting for somebody to get that treatment, and I got it. So, in other words, the philosophical argument is that Russia can contribute to the healing, if you like, of our European culture. Thank you.
When the Canadians hosted the Vancouver Olympics, it cost $6 billion for their Winter Olympics. When Vladimir Putin hosted the Sochi Olympics, it cost $50 billion to host the Olympics. Why so much more expensive? Because $44 billion was stolen. So when I hear these discussions about 20 billion being stolen and 380 billion being invested in the Russian economy, I have a lot of detailed forensic knowledge that that's simply not true. Now, I'll get to that in a second, but let's just look at Putin's record. So Vladimir Putin, in recent years, has annexed Crimea. That's the first time that a border of a European country has been changed by force. He has invaded eastern Ukraine, and his army has killed 15,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Russian bombers, 2,000 Russian servicemen and many dozens of Russian bombers have relocated to Syria to run bombing runs across Syria, killing innocent people, bombing hospitals, etc., and setting off a wave of refugees which has gone all over the world, including here to Germany. They've institutionalized sports cheating through doping, and so have been excluded from a number of Olympics and probably will be in the future. They have laundered hundreds of billions of dollars of illicit funds from Russia to the West and infected our banking system. And has, as Carole has said, have tried to interfere with just about every Western election, the French elections, the German elections, the British elections, and of course, as most people know, the US elections. So when I looked at this invitation, the West should make amends with Putin, I had to laugh because I can't imagine what we're making amends for. This is like a battered wife making amends to her husband who's beating her. We've got nothing to amend for. It's ridiculous. But furthermore, just for the sake of argument, I've heard people say, well, it was really our fault that by expanding NATO, we've provoked Putin to invading all these countries and cheating in the Olympics and doing all this other stuff. It was our fault. And we should really try to be nicer to him because maybe if we're nicer to him, then he'll be nicer to us. And I think that's an absurd thought. That's appeasement has never worked. But for anyone who harbors that thought, and maybe there are people thinking we really should do that, I just want to explain to you what the original sin is which has caused Putin to behave the way that he behaves, because there's nothing we can do to change his behavior. And the original sin is money. Vladimir Putin started out as president of Russia not because he wanted to run Russia. He started out as president of Russia because he wanted to get rich. And that's why everybody goes into government service in Russia, is to get rich. And over a period of time, Putin has gotten rich. I estimate him to be worth $200 billion. In order to get that $200 billion, he has had to kill, extort, kidnap, and do various other types of things to people. He's stolen that money from other people. He's stolen that money from the state. And the people around him, over a 20-year period, have stolen $1 trillion. Now, that's money that should have been spent on hospitals, on schools, on roads, on public services, that hasn't been spent on that. And Russia is supposed to be a democracy where everyone has a chance to pick their leader. And in a democracy, you can't steal all the money, make everybody else poor, and be reelected. And so, what do? Well, you make sure there's nobody running against you. You kill your opponents like Boris Nemtsov. You exile them like Garry Kasparov, or you put them in jail like Alexei Navalny and others. And so you get rid of all your competition. But even that still doesn't work if everybody is poor and you have all the money. And so what do you do then? Well, you can't, people are going to be angry at you, and so you have to make them angry at somebody else. So how do you do that? It's in Machiavelli 101. You find a foreign enemy. And so Ukraine should have never been an enemy of Russia. I can't think of two countries that have more in common with each other than Ukraine and Russia. But the Russians, through a propaganda campaign, created Ukraine as an enemy. They said that they were fascists and Nazis, and they were going to go after Russian-speaking people and eat Russian babies or whatever. And they did this over a 3-month period. Then they invaded, and that kind of worked, and that elevated Putin's approval ratings. They weren't mad at him anymore. They were mad at Ukraine. Eventually, people got tired of the Ukraine situation. They went into Syria. Eventually, they got tired of the Syria situation. He started hacking everybody's elections. He is not going to behave differently no matter what we do with him. It's all about him fearing his own people. And what I can tell you for sure is that as the economy continues to stagnate, as more money continues to be stolen, as people get angrier, and as the current things that he does wear off, he's going to have to do more bad stuff. And so there's only one possibility with Vladimir Putin, which is hardcore containment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like you to take the second vote. You know, you've heard the opening statements, you've heard the questions, and you may not want to cast your vote right away, but maybe get ready to cast it, because what we're now doing is we're going back to the speakers, and each speaker will have 2 minutes, and usually these 2 minutes are your last chance to sort of bring up your numbers, or reduce your numbers if you so intend, by sort of throwing at the audience the strongest points that you can think of in the defense of your side of the debate. And I will have to make sure that this does not take longer than 2 minutes. I'm sorry, because otherwise people will get nervous because they come here also for the nibbles later on. And we cannot frustrate them for too long. It's like, you know, it's a cage of carnivores here, and we have to feed them at some point. Now, while you get ready, I will proceed in reverse order, and you will hear this ping pong of arguments, and I then ask you to vote. You can also vote if you're determined right now, but that's after the 4 statements, voting will end. Okay? Bill, you go first.
So
2 minutes max.
I don't think I even have 2 minutes. It's pretty straightforward that we've done nothing to Russia, to Putin, that we need to make amends for. And Vladimir Putin has done everything that he needs to make amends with us. And there is no argument that I can see that would justify in any way an appeasement strategy towards Russia. We all know how that worked out in World War II. The famous Neville Chamberlain quote, we're now going to have peace in our time. We're not going to have peace by being nice to Vladimir Putin. We're going to have peace by putting up hard barriers around him.
Okay, there you have it. Richard, your 2 minutes, max.
At certain moments this evening, listening to our colleagues over there, I feel as if I've stumbled into some parallel universe. That this is not the Russia I know, this is not the Putin and the system which I've been studying for quite a few years. I don't think a single fact could be defended in any court of law or anywhere else in terms of disinformation. And policy difference isn't disinformation. It's normal debate and dialogue. And it's that dialogue which is denounced over here as appeasement, as somehow illegitimate or even legitimating interest. I mean, Russia is a power which has behaved and behaves like powers do in the international system. And so there's a bit of push and there's a bit of shove going on. As for the intervention in elections and so on, as we know in the United States, Nate Silver, who is the great poller, said it was effectively like a grain of salt in a salad bowl the size of Madison Square Garden. As for intervention in other elections, it's over and over again, it's hyped out. And the worst thing which happens often is that those who denounce misinformation and disinformation the most intensely are themselves guilty of, of not being factually based as we'd like to see. So this is now, we are indeed in some sort of a hole in which one side and the other side, and that's my whole point. We need to find a way out from that looking glass.
All right, thank you very much. Carole, you were the one, in your opening statement, I noticed by speaking about the ordinary Russians, the Russians. And so I'd like to ask you, do or don't we owe it to the ordinary Russian people to sort of somehow keep them engaged, not let them fall off the cliff because they happen to live in a mafia state, as you later on said?
That's a really interesting question because we have got far more in common with the Russian people than we do with our own oligarchs in our own countries. And that we are, in the West and in Russia, we are cannon fodder of the oligarchs. And that is Russian oligarchs and it is Western businessmen who buy data companies and harvest our data and use it to manipulate us. And essentially, what we are seeing is a world which is not divided in some ways along geopolitical lines. It's divided on a world in which the rich have now got the means to manipulate ordinary people through these technological platforms. I have to say, I think we've got to really, really hold fast to the facts. And so the thing about disinformation is that I just refer you again to the FBI report about what happened in the US election. And Bill spoke about the other things that Russia is doing in the world, but I've spent 3 years looking at the effects on democracy. And my point to you is that this isn't an endless, it's just not guaranteed that this is a political system that will endure. And at this moment in time, it is looking very, very fragile. And I think we have to take these threats extremely seriously. And one part of that threat is coming from Russia, because it has just learned how to use and manipulate these platforms in a way which is incredibly sophisticated. Part of it's still invisible to us and is just very, very dangerous.
Thank you. Dominique, you get the last word, which I think is appropriate. You come from France and can enlighten us. No,
I'm the oldest on the panel.
Okay, I don't take issue with that. We don't discriminate against age here in Berlin. I don't know how it is in Paris, but here you get the last word.
What would I say? For years, I was defending the geography of values versus the value of geography. I meant by that we had more in common with the United States because of democracy than with Russia because of geography and even culture. And the problem today is that the evolution of America has slightly transformed that. It doesn't mean that we should embrace Russia, but it means that the world has profoundly changed, and we have to adjust ourselves to these differences, these structural differences. Let's not confuse our priorities. Our priorities is to get better and to get our act together to face the huge challenge of China. And confronted with this challenge, the Russians are just like us, even more threatened than we are by China. I would say I don't like Putin. I think somewhere there's no difference between Russian tactics today and Soviet tactics yesterday. What is mine is mine. What is yours is negotiable. That was the Soviet tactics with a major difference. Russia is not, and is not going to return to be the Soviet Union.
All right. Thank you very much. I think that has been a very rich debate. Now, voting is closed. So voting is closed now, and as the numbers are being fabricated there, let me take that minute that is needed to evaluate the results, to already say a word of thanks to all four of you. You did a great job, and I think you made it very easy for me to sort of manage this, this panel. It has been a fantastic experience. Now, last time we had people saying yes, we should make amends with Putin. Don't show it now. 19% at the outset, and 59% said no, with 22% undecided. Now, let's see what it is now. Gee, the number of undecided has shrunk to, what is it, 11, or is that a 1? It's the handwriting is not very good. I can say that actually both camps have won in the course of the debate, because you have pulled people onto your side. So your side, your camp, the no camp, has won 6 percentage points, and the yes camp has won 5 percentage points. So the result, and now you should please show it, if you have it, it's yes, it's 24%, no, it's 65%, and undecided is a mere 11%. So we've halved the undecided people. But you see, after this debate, people are even more convinced, or to a larger share convinced, that we should not make amends with Russia, which then raises the question, what to do then? You know, if we don't do this, what do we do with a Russia, and I think that was part of your argument, with a Russia that does not go away? You know, whether we like it or not, it will be there. Now, for this is another topic for another occasion. I thank you all for coming and for participating in this.